Before I introduce Joel Fox to give the keynote address, Mark Levin, the Assistant Director of IGS, dug up from the Vanderbilt University News Archive the Walter Cronkite broadcast on Proposition 13, and you will, I think, see how the election was framed in the national media at that time. And I thought it'd be it's a brief, 5-6 minute? It's actually 10. It's about a 10-15 minute piece, which will, I think, serve as a nice backdrop to Joel's remarks. So after this, Joel, I'll ask you up. That was then, and this is now. Not so different in some respects.
Jerry Brown's still here.
Jerry Brown's still here. My daughter was 3 years old when 3 months old when Proposition 13 was passed, and everyone at the university was telling me to move to another state because there wouldn't be any schools for her to go to, but somehow that didn't happen. Anyway, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Joel Fox to give this keynote speech. Joel, I think, is known to anybody who has followed California politics and followed the taxing and spending conflicts. He now operates Joel Fox Consulting, a public affairs and political consulting firm. In May 2008, he launched Fox and Hounds Daily, a website that discusses the mix of business and politics in California. Prior to that, though, starting this firm in 1999, Joel worked for the Jarvis Taxpayers Association for 19 years, serving as its president from 86 to 98. He's taken a key role in many statewide and local ballot propositions, including the campaign to successfully pass Proposition 218, the right to vote on taxes measure on the 1996 ballot. Joel has authored hundreds of opinion articles which have appeared in all the major newspapers nationally and in the state, and his book, The Legend of Proposition 13, was published in May 2003. I could read much more from this impressive bio, but why don't I just turn over the floor to Joel to speak to us on Proposition 13.
Thank you, Jack. Jack asked me to title my talk, 30 Years After the Revolution, What Would Howard Jarvis Say? Well, the first thing Howard Jarvis would say to me is, "You're going where to talk about Proposition 13? Well, I appreciate the invitation, Jack. Thank you very much, and I will try to channel Howard along the way as we talk about this. The last time I was in this room, I was on a panel discussing the initiative process, and the audience was made up of elected officials from around the United States. And that day, the wrath of the audience was not aimed at me, because also on that panel that day was the proponent of the term limits initiative that had just passed in California, and these elected officials aimed their slings and arrows at that individual. I guess it's my turn again. What would Howard Jarvis say 30 years later? Well, in his crusty way, he'd say, "I told some of those popcorn balls it would work out all right. People are secure in their homes, and there is enough revenue coming into government." He used to claim that he talked to a number of experts leading up to Proposition 13 about the acquisition-type property tax system that he was introducing here in California, that with the turnover of homes and other properties, with the new building of properties, there would be a steady and rising income in the property tax in California. He would look out over the landscape of what's happened over the last number of years, and I'm sure he would pick some incidents, such as a few years back when a reconverted garage in the Silicon Valley sold for $1 million, yet the small 3-bedroom house down the street was not reassessed and its property taxes did not rise, and he would probably nod approvingly. Or he might remember the news article in the Newhall Signal newspaper in northern Los Angeles County prior to Proposition 13 that reported the incident of an older couple in a very small home who lived on land that was taxed at its highest and best use. That's how they used to tax it, at its highest and best use. And a motel could be built on that property. And that couple received a tax bill of $1,800 a year, and their total income was $1,900 a year. And he'd probably lean back in his chair and puff on his cigar and be happy. And what would he say to the critics of Proposition 13? Probably raise an angry fist and say hogwash, or something along those lines, maybe a little bit more colorful. Well, I won't be so dismissive. I'm going to talk about some of the criticisms on Proposition 13, and if Howard has something to say along the way, I'll let you know. You know, Proposition 13 has been blamed for all the ills that have befall California. Back in ancient Egypt, the plagues were from the hand of God. All of the problems in California seem to come from Prop 13, and we've seen the lists, from poor government service to the track coach that said he couldn't find his shot puts because the grass was too high because it wasn't cut enough since Proposition 13, to potholes, to rising fees, to the murder of a young girl. One writer said because the police didn't have compatible radios to contact each other, so it was Proposition 13's fault. Or right here in this area, 20 years ago when the earthquake struck, and the Los Angeles Times had an editorial cartoon that showed a car crushed by a freeway, and the license plate read Prop 13. And of course, my favorite one from the National Review magazine that claimed that the not guilty verdict in the O.J. Simpson trial was on Howard Jarvis's head because there wasn't enough money to hire competent police officers and coroner's officials. And as they say in the advertising world, that's only a partial listing. So now California is broke, and some turn their hungry eyes toward Proposition 13. They want to either blow it up or cut it back or give it a facelift or hope that its supporters' Neanderthal thinking somehow changes and people see the light. And if so, California will be healthy again because we'll be able to raise taxes and raise spending and take care of all of its problems. I often wonder why Proposition 13 is always discussed when we have a difficult economic time here in California. But on those occasions when the economy is going well and we have surpluses, there's never a whisper about Prop 13. I found it interesting in Bill Stahl's column in the Los Angeles Times last week when he talked about Prop 13, and he said it needed a facelift, and he talked about making it easier to raise new taxes. Nothing particularly new, but he closed and he said, make no mistake, it is Proposition 13, because of its real impact on state coffers, and its iconic role as a tax revolt symbol, whose reform is the crucial first step in assuring California's future. Its iconic role as a tax revolt symbol. Well, he's right. That's why a lot of people want to tear it down, because it's a symbol that people grab hold of. And it does have the elements of myths and legends within it. I would suggest you take a look at a legend we're all aware of, the legend of Robin Hood. You all think, well, that says take from the rich and give to the poor. But I would suggest to you you look a little deeper, because those who became rich did it with outrageous taxation. And the villains in the piece are Prince John, the head of the national government, and the sheriff, who was the tax collector and the head of the local government. Those elements exist in Prop 13. But if you're not fond of romantic tales, then let me suggest to you that Proposition 13 was a social movement, protecting people in their homes and giving stability to neighborhoods. No longer, when they build those, what do you call them, McMansions up in the Oakland Hills, it's not going to prompt a big tax increase on all the other neighbors because Proposition 13 is in place. It brings stability to neighborhoods, and that's one of the virtues of Proposition 13. Excuse me for a moment. The other thing that Proposition 13 did for people, I believe, in this iconic state is that it gave them the sense that they had the power over the government. They could make a change with their vote, and that's one of the things they cling to. And that's why I believe some people want to tear it down. But it still serves as a shield, and as you heard from Mark this morning, and his is the third consecutive poll in 2 weeks that show that Prop 13 is still embraced by the people of California by that same 2-to-1 margin it passed by in 1978. So let's look at some of the complaints. And I won't shy away from there's obviously, I was thinking of a Winston Churchill line about, which I will paraphrase to say, so many complaints in so little time for me to go over them all. But I'm going to take a half dozen, and I think I'm going to hit some of the highlights. And while you can write a dissertation on just about any one of these subjects we're going to talk about, I'll only be able to touch on them for a few minutes. But let's talk about the two-thirds vote. Let's talk about the fact that residential property and commercial property pay different amounts. Let's talk about power going from local governments to Sacramento. Let's talk about that unfortunate term, fiscalization of land use. Let's talk about the schools, and let's talk about the equality of taxes and side-by-side homes paying different taxes depending on when they were purchased. First, to the two-thirds vote. Yes, Proposition 13 put in the state constitution the requirement that the state legislature needs a two-thirds vote to increase taxes, and also the requirement on the local level that a two-thirds vote is needed to raise special taxes. It did not, however, put in the two-thirds vote to pass the budget, nor did it put in the two-thirds vote to increase taxes to pay off local general obligation bonds. Both of those measures predate Proposition 13 by many years. In fact, the issue of raising taxes to pay for bonds, the two-thirds vote was in the 1879 Constitution, 100 years prior to Proposition 13. And what's important to note about both the budget issue and the bond issue is that at times the people and even the legislative leaders over history in this country believed there is an appropriate time to have a supermajority vote. You can find a supermajority vote 10 times in the United States Constitution. Juries require a supermajority vote or even a unanimous vote in certain cases to convict. A supermajority vote is a protection to bring consensus around an issue. And we believe that a supermajority vote, a two-thirds vote, is important when you're taking property in the form of taxation from the people, and it's an appropriate hurdle to have. Now, to the issue of the split roll, where business property and residential property pay different amounts. Jarvis was asked, why did you give business this break? And his response was, for 50 years prior to Proposition 13, business property, residential property were always paid on the same basis. If business gets a break because of Proposition 13, that means it had been getting a break for the previous 50 years. And that was his response. I will tell you, I think the split roll is a bad idea for the economy. And I noted a couple of times today in earlier sessions when we got questions about taxing business differently, it was always, let's tax the corporations. Let me tell you, if you split the roll, the victim is going to be small business. They're the ones that are going to pick up the big burden. Nearly every small business signs a lease when they move into their property that they are responsible for any tax increase. It's not going to be the big corporations that owns the big tall tower in downtown San Francisco. It's going to pass it on to the small business that occupies the individual offices. This may surprise you, but some business associations actually use Proposition 13 as a selling tool to try to convince businesses to come to California. Why is that? Because in many other states, businesses are subjected to the subjective assessments laid down by the assessor, and they fight with them all the time on how much a property value is worth. What they tell those businesses is if you come to California, you can budget for what your taxes are going to be, and you know what they're going to be year in and year out. If there is a split roll, I believe it's going to be laid heavily on the small business, and of course, all of us, frankly, because when they can, they will pass the tax on through the services and the goods they provide. Power to Sacramento. Well, here's one I think that I'm going to find some agreement with you. Jarvis said that the phrase that he put into Proposition 13, that taxes should be apportioned according to law, was his attempt to make sure that those services and those agencies that received taxes revenue prior to Proposition 13 would also receive it post Proposition 13, and nothing would be cut out, that those who would get it before would get it post. And that's why he wrote apportion to law. Obviously, the legislature saw that they're in charge of the law, so they're going to be in charge of how some of the revenue is passed through. Proposition 13, I think, on this point, it was not Jarvis's intent at all to have that power move from the locals to the state, but I think clearly you have to make an argument that that's what occurred. The next issue is the one called fiscalization of land use. It's a term that I don't think 1 in 4 million Californians would know about, but and we heard about it earlier. Let me just say that I believe that it is not, to the taxpayer advocate community, not a large issue. We believe that a lot of those retail shops that are built in communities would probably be built anyway. A lot of the companies do a lot more polling than politicians do to find out where there's the best place to put these shops and where the consumers would come to benefit from them. And if the solution is to this fiscalization of land use to raise the property tax, then I don't believe you're going to get much support out of the voters to do that. The next issue, however, that is a big issue is schools. And as you heard earlier, there is more money in schools today in constant inflation-adjusted dollars than there was prior to Proposition 13. The question is, how is that money being spent? And it could be the education problem, which I can see there certainly is a problem and things could be done better, but it's much bigger than just the money that's being spent. There's the question of administration. There's the question of union rigidity. There's the question of parental involvement or non-involvement. And it's not just the money, but money is an interesting and important factor. I heard a speech this past weekend from Senator Dick Ackerman, who claimed that only 60 to 65% of the Prop 98 money got down to the local level. If that's true, it should be investigated. I want to read you a quote that talks about money in schools, and I want to first let you know that this quote is 17 years old, so it's not exactly timely, but I think it makes the point because it's not about California. And I want you to know that the problems that you're concerned about and that you often blame on Prop 13 with the schools is not a California problem. In fact, when I use the figure of dollars spent per student, $12,000 a student, remember that was 17 years ago, and we're not even quite there in California at this time. It says, in our town, the school system is spending just over $12,000 a pupil. That should make it roughly the elementary equivalent of Stanford. Instead, people who are able to send their children to private and parochial schools because they believe the public schools are substandard. This makes us like many other urban residents in the country. The cupboard is bare, and taxpayers everywhere are looking around to see where the money has gone. And the answer in so many cases is that it has been badly spent. So wrote Anna Quinlan in the New York Times about New York City schools, where there is no Proposition 13 and where they have the ability to raise property taxes at will. The final issue I wanted to touch upon was the equality issue, side-by-side taxes, neighbors paying different taxes. Understand that the property tax never has been a fee-for-service tax. There have always been people paying more money for the same garbage pickup. The rich house on the hill paid a lot more for the same garbage pickup as the person who had the small house on the bottom of the hill. Property tax is a general fund tax, so the argument that's always raised about fee-for-service is not an accurate argument. But I used to get those phone calls when I was at the Jarvis office, people complaining, I'm paying more than my neighbor. But you know what? That same person who called me one year stopped calling me the next. Why? Because this acquisition-type system worked for them. They saw that their taxes were certain and in check, and when someone a few years later moved into their neighborhood and paid a lot more money, their taxes didn't all of a sudden spring up. So those who started complaining got comfortable with it. And I think this validates one of the things that Mark pointed out this morning with his poll, when he said there was always the assumption that people who more recently bought their property would be anti-13, but that didn't necessarily show up in the poll. That's because very quickly people realized the value of the acquisition-type system benefiting them and protecting them. This question of equality, by the way, I think is an important one in economics. And with your permission, just one more quote here from Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations. The certainty of what each individual ought to pay is, in taxation, a matter of so great importance that a very considerable degree of inequality is not near so great an evil as a very small degree of uncertainty. I believe that Proposition 13 has captured Smith's notion of certainty. Or if you would like to hear a different way of putting it, a writer I believe she was in the Bay Area of a very small newspaper, said Proposition 13 reminded her of her grandmother's quilt. Each patch was different, but when sewn together, the quilt kept everybody warm. Proposition 13, the key, before 13 passed, and this was stated earlier, but to me this is the heart and soul of Proposition 13. This is the revolutionary idea of Proposition 13. Before Proposition 13 passed, the certainty of taxation belonged to the tax collector. Now it belongs to the taxpayer. And that is the revolutionary idea behind Proposition 13. And I will take all the complaints against 13 and put them on the scale opposite all of the letters of thanks for letting us stay in our home, thanks for letting my parents stay in our home, that still come in today 30 years later, and validated by all of the polls that have come out recently showing the support. Jarvis used to say that a ship can't sail on yesterday's wind. He knew that once he passed Proposition 13, he would still have to be out there trying to defend it. And that's why he started the Taxpayers organization that now bears his name. And it's interesting to me that over this past year, there have been tax revolts and tax unrest in many states over property taxes in the United States. In Indiana, they picketed the governor. In Florida, there was a whole spread in Time magazine last summer over the property tax problems there. Right now, as we speak, in Arizona, there are two initiatives, both claiming to be prodigy of Proposition 13, trying to qualify for this November's ballot. There was a ballot circulated in Nevada, and there's also one up in Washington State. But in California, we have peace over the property taxes because people believe that they are protected and that the system works. And one other important thing about that, it works because we believe that government is getting a steady, growing revenue under the acquisition-type property tax system. In fact, the property taxes are the most stable tax in California. You've already heard about how revenue drops drastically and goes up in an earlier presentation on the income tax and the sales tax. In my home county of Los Angeles, since 1980, the average increase of the property tax year in and year out is a 7% increase. This year, with this terrible housing crisis we have, officials still say property taxes in Los Angeles County are going up 5%. And last time there was a major hiccup in the California economy in the 90s, one Los Angeles County assessor official was quoted in the press saying, "Thank goodness for Proposition 13, because the property taxes are still going up even though the economy is way down." We believe the system works. Is Proposition 13 a perfect law? there is no perfect law. But I would suggest to you, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the life of the law is not logic, it is experience. What is the experience in California? The tax revolts began in the late 50s and the 60s and up to Proposition 13 in 1978. You heard earlier there were other measures on the ballot that were turned down. The legislature didn't act. And I think this same idea of experience tells you that the reforms that many of you seek will run into a big stumbling block because the people have experience about what will happen, whether they can trust the legislature to keep promises and to do what they're told and follow through on some of the promises they make. The two-thirds vote issue about lowering taxes, I think, is one that has been tried most recently in 2004 and defeated 2-1. And if you look at all of the tax measures that are lined up in the legislature, ready to go, I doubt very much, because of the experience people have, if they will make a deal on that measure. As the judge tells the jury, look at the preponderance of the evidence. I believe the preponderance of the evidence is that Proposition 13 has been a good thing for California and for its citizens. And let me just conclude with a little look at actually some of today's editorials. This one I read coming up on the plane today in the San Diego Union, just a couple of numbers, and I didn't know exactly where to throw them in. I'll put them in here. San Diego Union talked about, since 1980, the population in the state of California has gone up 58%. Inflation has gone up 131%. State budget has gone up 400%, and the property tax has gone up 500% since 1980. And Howard Jarvis probably would say, what did I do wrong? He certainly didn't cut off revenue to government. In today's Los Angeles Times, they started their editorial by just saying that Prop 13 turns 30 today, which means officially it's no longer young. In wishing it a happy birthday and ushering it into a healthy middle age, we want to slim down, get a checkup, and consider some cosmetic surgery. I prefer the way the Los Angeles Times started their editorial on Prop 13's 20th anniversary. Then, they said, Proposition 13 is 20 years old and it's time to proclaim the tax-cutting measure is a success. The ballot brainchild of Howard Jarvis and others has been vilified by critics for 2 decades and blamed for much of what ails California. But at the heart of it, the measure did exactly what Jarvis promised. More important, it fulfilled the demands of California homeowners, many of whom legitimately feared that runaway property taxes would force them from their homes. And Howard Jarvis would say, damn right. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity to talk to you today.
We have a little time for Q&A.
Joel, today we have another earthquake in the sense of the housing crisis in California.
Right.
And unlike in the past, most of the loans of people on their houses are not true mortgages. They're actually promissory notes and a mortgage, which means that over and above the value of the home, they can go after their future income, and the bankruptcy laws have been modified as well. And so this confronts the property tax system with a dilemma, because in some cases these houses go down as much as 40, 50% in value. And that will, of course, affect revenues. It will affect housing values. How do you see that playing out in relation to the problem? And I think we've skipped over the fact that the property tax, going back to the agricultural America, is not a net worth tax anyway.
Well, on your point about with the way the acquisition property tax system works, clearly homes that have been purchased recently with the big drop that you described in the value of homes will affect the bottom line on property taxes. However, because of the way the acquisition property tax system works, homes that have been on the rolls for a long time are paying taxes based on their assessment value plus the 2% increase, not the market value. So when the market drops that much, those homes are probably still paying the same tax plus the 2% increase. And that explains why, as I said in my remarks, property taxes continue to go up even during the tough times. Now, there could be a tipping point. If the tough times continue where it may drive them down, and there may be certain counties where there's been a lot of more recent building, I think out San Bernardino County, for example, or Riverside County, may come to that tipping point a lot sooner. But because of the Proposition 13 system, that's why that assessor said, thank goodness for Prop 13, because we're measured on the assessment rolls, not the market value. And when the market value drops, it still has to drop all the way down here to cause some negative cash flow into the coffers, and that really generally has not happened. I'm not saying it can happen, but it really hasn't happened in some of the counties that I've looked at. Uh-oh.
Joe, what do you think would have happened in 1978 if there had been no initiative process in California?
Well, your theory, Peter, has always been that the legislature would have responded to the anger, and it may be true. But let me answer it this way, because when Isaac Martin put his chart up on the wall, and he said there have been tax reforms in these certain states following Prop 13, and some of the states that were the color red, which showed there were tax reform, were Florida, in Indiana, and Washington State. Now, I just mentioned those three states in my talk just now, because obviously that tax reform that they provided, whatever it was, and I'm not sure, Isaac can probably tell us, I'm not sure what they did back then, it wasn't enough, because we see a tax revolt this very year in those three states. So my feeling is, what would they have done? They might have tried to play around the edges and trade around the margins and maybe reduce the steam at the time. But would it have been enough? I'm not sure, and I doubt it. Prop 13 has given us certainty for 30 years.
Washington State and Florida both have the initiative process. And in fact, the Washington State tax reforms were accomplished through the initiative process.
Right, and then a court threw it out.
Yeah, but would that not have, if it had gone through the legislative process, would that not have retained much more citizen engagement with the conventional political electoral representative government than we have in California now?
Well, I mean, it's a conjecture. It could have. I don't know. I mean, citizens are engaged now by making a lot of the decisions that you don't like them to make on the ballot. But whether the legislature would have put through a satisfactory resolution to the problem in 1978, I doubt it would have been very long term. I think it would have been tamped down. Remember, there was tax agitation in California in the 60s. There was 1968, the Phil Watson initiative was on the ballot. In 1972, he came back with another one. When Reagan announced that he was running for governor, in his announcement speech, one of the things he talked about was reducing property taxes for seniors. So it goes back a long way. And all of the talk is always to work on the margins just to take a little of the anger out. Prop 13 was a much more long-term solution.
In your talk, you talked about commercial property, and you described it as if the taxes on the property are passed on to the tenants.
Yes, in many cases they are.
That's true in the case of commercial property that is leased to others.
Right.
But that's not all kinds of commercial property that there are. There are plenty of owner-occupied properties, and there are properties, manufacturing companies, repair installations, and that sort of thing. Now, all of those properties and all of the business establishment in California has benefited greatly from the enormous amount of prosperity that has occurred in California in the last 30 years. And we have new requirements, for instance, in the schools for computers that have to be bought that did not exist in 1978. Why do you feel it's unfair for those commercial property owners to pay a fair share of what they've received as a result of the 30 years of prosperity that we've seen in California? and not be limited to just the 2% increase each year.
Well, how do you define a fair share?
Proportional to the value of their property.
California business property pays 2/3 of all property taxes paid in the state of California. 2/3 comes from business property. And you're right. I pointed out that I thank you for the clarification. I thought I made it clear that I was talking about a lot of small businesses that are affected. Certainly there are businesses that are owner-occupied. I don't deny that. But a great bulk of the businesses are small businesses, and they certainly would be affected through the pass-through, as we both agree they have leases. But business property pays 2/3. And I might also point out on the business side of things, the business climate in California is not a healthy one. The Milken Institute down in Santa Monica came out with a study recently, and they have California as the 6th most difficult business climate with all the fees, the taxes, the corporate taxes, everything else to do business. Adding another burden is not going to help the business climate in California.
We have time for one last question.
I mean, my question, as it turns out, is very much related to his question as well, and that is that you made a very good speech and you made very strong points, but the platform upon which they hinge is the same ones that they hinged back in 1978 when Proposition 13 passed, and that is that property tax increases are going to affect people who own their homes and they're not going to be able to keep up with tax increases. However, there's also the issue of the commercial property, which, I mean, you kind of glossed over significantly in your speech. And that is that, I mean, the dominant form of new retail development in California right now are strip malls, especially in a lot of our growing towns. And yet a lot of those strip malls are now owned by a single corporation, which now gets to benefit from the tax freezes, but their lessors do not. So essentially, this is creating a situation where the owner of that strip mall can change over the business that lease from them, thereby increasing their profits, but are not paying increased property taxes because of that, because of the change in the value of the property. So that creates an inequality. So how would you respond to this?
First of all, in my own defense here, I don't think I glossed over the issue of business taxes. I think I took it head on and discussed it. In your example of strip malls, the strip mall, you talk about the owner, but it's made up of smaller businesses within the strip mall, and they're the ones that are paying the tax. And you also mentioned that these are new strip malls. With the new strip malls, they're paying taxes when they develop that mall. I assume recently it's at the full market value. But again, I think you make the point. I think you're making the same point I'm making, really, that the individual stores or shops within that strip mall are ultimately going to be responsible and ultimately will be hit with the taxes if there is a change in the property tax system and let's say the taxes are reassessed every year or whatever, because those taxes will go from the bill will go to the corporation, but the corporation through the leases will require that the smaller businesses pay the taxes, and that's the way it works.
I think that these issues about the economic impacts and the fiscal impacts are the topic of the next two panels. So I think some of the themes that Joel so eloquently articulated are going to be revisited. And I want to just thank you very much for a wonderful address.